Some of the men say it's one of those abdominal snowmen. Hello, my name is Will, and this is Exploding Airboat, the only podcast in the world dedicated to celebrating airboat explosions in films. Now, if there's one place you expect to find an airboat, it's in a swamp. So it would have been a crime against cinema if a film entitled Swamp Thing failed to feature our favourite form of air-assisted water transport. Luckily, listeners, we're happy to report there's airboat action aplenty in the film we're reviewing today, 1982's Swamp Thing. To help me review the film, I'm joined by a man who, like an airboat, is entirely powered by the expulsion of hot air. It's the returning champion, Nick Rehak. Welcome back to the show, Nick.
Thank you very much for having me, Will.
Well, it is a pleasure to have an airboat enthusiast like yourself to discuss a classic of the airboat genre like Swamp Thing.
Yeah, I don't often get the chance to talk about airboats, so the fact that I have this outlet and this medium to do so, I'm excited.
Well, let's not waste any time then getting stuck into this film and all of its airboat action. So let's listen to Trailer Man give us a rundown of the characters in the film.
Government agents, scientists, soldiers, master criminals, secret formulas, monsters and midgets. None of them belong in this swamp. Only one thing does. The Swamp Thing.
Uh-huh. Here comes trouble.
The Swamp Thing.
There goes the neighborhood.
Adrienne Barbeau and the Swamp Thing, an outrageous pair in the incredible adventure that grows on you or all over you. The Adventures of the Swamp Thing. The comic book legend lives.
While on the verge of a scientific breakthrough that could end world hunger, an altruistic botanist, played by Ray Wise, is placed under the protection of Adrienne Barbeau's special government agent. A mad outlaw scientist, the always debonair Louis Jourdan, wants to steal Ray's research for his own nefarious ends, but an unforeseen accident during the heist turns Wise into the Swamp Thing and an enormous plant-like creature that fights back against Jourdan's henchmen. Swamp Thing came out in 1982. It was written and directed by Wes Craven and based on the comic character of the same name. The film got a sequel in 1989, Return of the Swamp Thing, and since then the character has reappeared in 2 TV series and an animated series. Earlier this year, a reboot of Swamp Thing was announced as part of the DC Comics universe. Swamp Thing has a 5.3 rating on IMDb and a 2.6 out of 5 rating on Letterboxd. So, with all that out of the way, Nick, what did you make of Swamp Thing?
Not a fan. Not a fan at all. It was really tough getting through this one. It felt much longer than an hour and a half. In fact, when it got to the scene with the grand exploding airboat, I was like, okay, cool. I'm just going to finish this movie now and not watch the rest. But I'm a big fan of Ray Wise, so I pushed through and I continued, and we got there. It's certainly a movie. Got a couple flaws to it, sure, but it's a lot. It's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, I think I'm in a similar boat to yourself. It is far from a perfect movie in my view. I actually think things start pretty promisingly. I quite enjoy the first half hour, but it does get very draggy in the middle third of the film, and I do think that the finale is quite a bit of a damp squib. I mean, the film does have some interesting actors in, does have a nice strand of comedy, but yeah, overall, it's a bit of a disappointing work for my money.
Yeah, it really is. And like you said, there's a lot of promise. It starts out really well, especially for me. I'm not very familiar with Swamp Thing. Creature from the Black Lagoon, sure. I've heard that handful of times, and I'm fairly certain I've seen it once or twice, the Universal Monsterverse, if you will. But with DC characters, I've always been more on the true superhero side of things, Batman, Superman, et cetera, et cetera. So to have an introduction like this, I'm like, oh, this makes perfect sense on how he becomes the Swamp Thing and how the character acts and doesn't act and what its powers are and aren't. But like you said, it starts to drag, and it really, really, really drags and just about takes you out of it. And then when it picks back up, it's like, and now we're over. And
Yeah, there's a lot of stumbling
bizarre.
around in the swamp
Mm-hmm.
in
Literally.
the middle portion of the movie where motivations are not entirely clear, and it just feels like time is ticking by for us all.
Yeah, it's like they're treading water, and they just keep going around in circles, and they're not really going anywhere. Nothing is advancing the plot. Nothing keeps you excited and engaged.
Well, I don't know if it's treading water; it's more like tramping through water. But
Yeah, yeah.
given given the swamp setting for this film, but one thing that I found quite interesting about this film, even if overall I found it a little bit disappointing, was the tone that it decided to pick. And we've got a writer director, Wes Craven, who put this film together. Best known for his horror movies, and here he is making an adaptation of what I understand to be a horror comic, because I have to confess I have not read any of the kind of original source material. But what we actually get served here is, I don't know how you felt. I actually found it's quite a goofily told story, and for me, it's one that kind of riffs on those old mad scientist films from the 40s, or those sort of creature feature films from the 50s. And I guess I was a little, I guess I was sort of intrigued by the tone that they went for. I mean, I don't know, what did you make of that particular aspect?
I would absolutely agree. It jumps around, it doesn't really know what it wants to do, and at times there's comedic elements that make you wonder, well, should it have been this way the entire time, like kind of a comedy horror spoof, or did they just kind of lose it, and that's where the meandering and kind of the trampling comes through in the middle? Because like we've stated, great premise, strong start, but it just immediately peters out. And I think the tonal shifts do not help it at all. And also visual shifts. There's a lot of time where the film just doesn't match up. Like you could tell it's
Mm.
very different grades and stock, or the cinematography is a little bit different. There's just things that are happening that it doesn't line up, and that kind of takes you out too. And it's like, well, why does it look that way versus that? Oh, that looked cool. Why didn't it have that theme the whole time? And at oftentimes I kept checking. I'm like, is this from 82? Because it feels like mid 70s. It feels like mid 70s B film. And then you mentioned it being Wes Craven, and I'm like, well, maybe this is like the first thing he did. It's not. He had already done Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes, so he established himself as like a whoa, like this is going to be a spooky dude. But then takes a huge step back, I think, with this movie, and I don't know. And I think you're right, especially when it comes to like the idea, like this is Wes Craven. If you go in having seen his other films, or at least know his other works, you have a certain expectation, and when it's not met, it becomes a bit of a mess and disappointment.
And beyond the sort of inconsistencies of the tone, I think there's also just some other inconsistencies in character that left me a little bit confused, and I think end up hurting the film as well, because we've got Adrienne Barbeau's character in this film, who in the first sort of half an hour of the movie, she sort of quite quickly establishes herself as a very like self-sufficient woman, frankly as a bit of a badass. We see her, she's out there like fixing equipment. The kind of the baddies turn up, and she's then grabbing a machine gun, shooting somebody dead. She's getting into like a fist fight with one of the goons as well, and she downs him and carries on with what she's up to. But then later in the film, she suddenly is turned into the sort of the classic stereotypical damsel in distress, where she's hapless in the face of the villains and his henchmen. And it was just, well, what happened to that interesting character that we had at the start of the film? Once she gets turned into the love interest, she becomes a far less interesting character, and it seems very bizarre given the person that we meet in the first 20-25 minutes of the movie.
Yeah, it's a sad default in a way, because they kept saying like Cable, and I'm like, okay, it's like we got ourselves a Ripley here, we have ourselves like a Sigourney Weaver, especially with a very similar hairdo. It's like, imagine visually, it's like a cross between Sigourney Weaver and like Weird Al with the Hawaiian shirt, right? And just very tight curls in that hair. But yeah, like in the beginning, like she's punching people out, she's firing off guns with confidence. It's not like, oh, what does this do? It's no, I'm ripping it. She shot and killed somebody. Like she knows what she's doing. But then to just slowly devolve, like you said, it doesn't make sense, and it makes her all that less interesting. And I'm like, oh, like I lose it, and I'm like, I don't care anymore. Like I check out.
Well, let's talk about the monster costumes here. Now, listeners to Exploding Airboat will know that you are a big Godzilla fan. So we know that you love films with, rubber-suited men as monsters. What did you make of the ones that we get here?
So Swamp Thing itself, I can appreciate the attempts and what they were trying to do, but it reaches a point where there's no real creativity. There's no character to it. It just looks like a stump that has like kind of come to life. Towards the end, bit of a spoiler, we have another character who ingests the goo, if you will, and becomes a creature, and they turn into a very wolf-like creature. And that one, it has, something about it. It's got the mane, it's got like the snout-like face. It adds a little more to it, almost like a scale armor kind of thing. Whereas this guy is just bland, and he can easily blend in. I was expecting more like vines and more just like swampy things. Give me some moss, stuff where he's like dripping off of him, just more of a gruesome appearance. And we didn't get that. And again, I appreciated some of the practical effects of it, especially some of the face paint and prosthetics. Those look good, right? But everything else just falls apart. It looks like a lesser. Did you see Stranger Things season 4?
No, I bailed after the end of the second series.
Well, in the 4th season, there's the big baddie that they're going after, and these two look very similar to an extent. But imagine this is like a Kmart version or whatever cheap department store y'all have over there. Imagine that compared, to what we could have gotten, and it's a little disappointing for me.
Yeah, I was interested the fact that you seem to find the secondary monster in this film actually an improvement on Swamp Thing, because I personally thought Swamp Thing, the costume was. I found that his costume was began to be a problem in the film, because he just sort of ends up lumbering around, and he just doesn't seem to be it doesn't create a kind of an idea of this being a powerful monster. I've watched a lot of these 1950s creature features, and I think I'm very forgiving of the special effects. I kind of think, working with a limited budget, what was expectations at the time. I think surely in 1982 they could have come up with something better than what we get in this film. So I felt quite unforgiving towards the realization of Swamp Thing in this film. But I think that where I really hit the wall with this film was actually the introduction of that second monster later in the film, because for me that was just so laughable, because it has this sort of wild hair coming out of it, and it just is. It just seemed to me to be like one of the sort of monsters that William Shatner would encounter in 1960s Star Trek when he beams down to a particular planet where literally it seems like somebody spent, 20 minutes in a dressing up box in the kind of wardrobe department, like, let's put this wig with this outfit, and that'll be the monster in this episode. I mean, yeah, I think the secondary monster was where I was just like, oh, this film's completely pooped the stoop on it.
Well, at least with the second one, we have some character, right? We have that wig, we have the face, we have those very intense dead eyes, and just more animalistic behavior. Whereas, like you said, Swamp Thing just kind of lumbers about, and it's just like a guy. It's like Eeyore if he was a monster, just kind of sad, stares at the ground a lot. But towards the end of the film, I don't know if they shot it chronologically or not, but towards the end of the film, they really didn't try to hide or give it any type of movement to kind of take away I guess dial back the fact that it's a rubber suit. They just kind of just like, yeah, whatever, and then they keep going. So it feels kind of like everything else. Started strong, and then they just kind of gave up.
Yeah, I mean, I should say, in fairness to Wes Craven, I have seen comments by him where I don't think he was happy with the realization of the monsters in this particular movie, and from what I understand, that there were quite a few budgetary issues with this film, that Craven didn't have the money that he wanted or that he expected to have to work with on this particular film. So I think,
oh, you don't say.
So I don't think that I don't think Craven put this together thinking, yeah, this is the monster that I always wanted to bring to the screen. So yeah, it may be a product of some factors that were outside of his control. But talking of Swamp Thing, he is one of the lesser known comic book heroes, yet this character has kind of gained a cult following. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, he's reappeared over the years in different media, and sounds like he's going to be coming back again as part of the DC universe that is they're trying to build up at the moment. I mean, what do you think is the appeal of the character here?
I think just the fact that he's an outsider and no one really knows his true abilities and strength. And I think that speaks to all of humanity. We don't really know what we're capable of until we're in that moment, and then we kind of learn something new about ourselves. But, Swamp Thing's a true outcast. It's an unfortunate accident, and rather than have the ability to crawl walls and sling around like a spider, or rather than be able to turn into a Hulk and destroy just a myriad of things, no, you're just this swampy, lumbering guy, like protecting a swamp area. You don't go to this fancy apartment. You don't go hanging out, and you're not signing autographs at diners and things like that. You're just in the woods hiding, watching people bathe on occasion, or just jumping at people on boats. Just it's not glamorous, and I think sometimes people just want to go the opposite direction of what they see, and just kind of flock to that. And it's also makes it that much more creatively challenging. You can do a big playboy millionaire turn vigilante, very easy to do, and you can zazz it up where they're meeting celebrities and doing other stuff. But with Swamp Thing, you have a sandbox, and you have just so many different directions you can go, but what direction do you go in? How do you do it to kind of make it believable or keep it grounded? And I know DC lately, they've been trying to, keep things a little grounded. So it's like, how do you do that with Swamp Thing? You can't just have a whole movie set in a swamp, because then it's like, well, what if they leave the swamp? Swamp Thing's just stuck there. Like, you know what I mean?
Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see what they do with this new realization of the character. I think we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be looking at the exploding airboat action.
War Dogs, the assassination team. A deadly group of soldier killers for hire. Their leader, a psychopathic ex-Vietnam officer who has created these perfect killing machines. Guerrillas, terrorists, and murderers, all involved in a government operation gone wrong.
Only these two decorated heroes can stop these Mad Dog assassins. Action, revenge, murder. These men deserve a medal for staying alive against the bloodthirsty war dogs. Cash in now on the non-stop action movie that explodes on the screen with bullet-by-bullet ferocity from beginning to end. War Dogs.
We're back, and now we're looking at the exploding airboat action. This occurs about an hour into the film as Arcane, the villain of the piece, his goons are searching for a Swamp Thing in a motorboat and a couple of airboats. The villains spot the monster and try to kill Swampy by throwing grenades around, but Swampy ambushes the hunters and takes over their speedboat. Our heroic vegetable then pilots the speedboat at the soldiers' airboat. Realizing they're about to be rammed, the soldiers and Swampy leap out of their respective vehicles before the two watercraft collide and explode. So, Nick, what did you make of the exploding airboat action?
I love the explosion. I love the lead up to it, but it still leaves me a little something to be desired. And as someone that has been around boats a lot growing up, I know it wouldn't be that easy to blow up. So it starts to feel a little unrealistic. But then again, this is Swamp Thing, where a man has turned into a swamp creature. So, you know, you got to take everything with just a bit of a grain of salt. What really throws me is we're on this flaming boat and it's looking great. And suddenly there's a weird fade or wipe or edit or whatever you want to call where it looks like a little explosion and then it like goes into the next scene. There's a lot of really weird like edits and transitions like that. It almost looks like a PowerPoint presentation. And I'm like, this is like, I get it, but come on. And then I feel like it kind of cheapens it in a way afterward. And I'm like, just let me enjoy this fiery explosion. Let me enjoy just this little bit of color that's brought into a film that's very just green and brown.
Yeah, some of the transitions in this film are quite jarring. As you say, the style of them is very noticeable, and I think that is, from what I understand, they were trying to create the impression of a comic book through some of the editing choices that they were making in the film. But equally, even with those particular decisions for how they like wipe the screen or how they cut to another scene, even then some of the transitions are still very odd. But yeah, talking about the exploding airboat in this particular scene, very cool explosion. I enjoyed that tremendously. But you know what, Nick, I was a little upset by how this airboat exploded because I didn't want to see it explode because it got sort of dominated by a motorboat, by another form of water transport. You know, I like to think of the airboat as the king of the water, and here it is getting, you know, destroyed by a communal garden and motorboat. So I was a bit distressed really by the method of destruction, and that kind of soured the experience for me, Nick.
You know what? I'm going to agree because when you think of an airboat, a lot of them, they're not just on the water, but they're shooting over land or they're shooting over very, very, very shallow water because they don't have an engine, right? They have a huge propeller propped into the back and they stay on the water. Here I'm thinking there's going to be a moment where they're chasing after Swamp Thing and he gets on land and they're like, oh, we'll show you. And they kind of go after him. And I'm expecting like, you know, a stormtrooper on the Forest Moon of Endor kind of hitting a tree and exploding. Or at some point, Swamp Thing kind of grabs it and launches it a certain way. And again, it hits a tree and explodes. Or just something a little more, I guess, aerobic. Something a little more intensity rather than just it's sitting there, it gets struck perpendicular, and now it's exploded.
A little bit more dynamic. I think that's
the word.
That's the word. Yeah. But yeah, no, I completely agree. It could have done with a bit more oomph. It just gets run over by a motorboat, and that for me, as an airboat enthusiast, was a little bit sad to see. I mean, in fairness to the film, we do get some good airboat action. We do get some, we get to see these airboats speeding through the swamp, chasing after the Swamp Thing, and we do get to see one that hits some sort of bed of reeds or some sort of growth in the swamp, and it kind of sort of leaps into the air and flips over. That was cool to see. So overall, there's some good airboat action here to enjoy. There's quite a quality explosion, but tainted by the method of destruction. Sadly, yeah, a little bit of an insult, I think, to the airboat in the choices that they made there.
I would unfortunately have to agree with that statement.
Okay, I think that just about wraps things up for this edition of Exploding Airboat. Nick, before we go, is there anything that you want to plug?
Yeah, just really quick. I'm on a recent episode of Movie, Films, and Flicks. Host Mark Hoffmeyer invited me on to discuss our favorite movie posters, where the main subject of said poster is in a perilous position. A visual splendor such as that makes for a great audio podcast, so be sure to seek that episode out and have a good time.
As always, don't forget to check out the Exploding Airboat website. We'll be back soon, but until then, keep watching the swamps for those exploding airboats.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
Smart. That thing is smart.
Very smart, Bruno, very smart. This thing has considerable intelligence. He's like a brilliant chess player. He anticipates every move. A strong adversary is like a beautiful, dangerous woman. I've never been able to resist either. Tell the captain to weigh anchor.
We're going home.
No, we're not. Captured our knight. Exposed his queen. Our